They are over there! Provide cover fire now! Move out!
Dawn breaks slowly over a low ridge of coral and churned earth. It is late spring, 1945. Somewhere on Okinawa, the air is already heavy with moisture and cordite. The Japanese infantrymen waiting in shallow fighting pits have not slept. They expected silence by now. A pause, a chance to move wounded men, to shift ammunition, to breathe. That is how battles have always worked. Fire, contact, withdrawal. Then night, then stillness. But the stillness never comes. Instead, American artillery begins again, methodical, unhurried, precise. Not a single massive barrage, but a rhythm. Shells falling at measured intervals. Mortars follow, then machine guns probing forward. When the infantry advances, it does not stop at the first resistance. It does not pull back at dusk. Hour follows hour. Morning bleeds into afternoon. Afternoon into night. The pressure never lifts. For the Japanese defenders, this is not just a tactical problem. It is a violation of everything they understand about combat. Battles are meant to pause. Men are meant to recover. Enemies are meant to withdraw. The Americans do not. And in that realization, quiet, terrifying, undeniable, the ground war in the Pacific begins to feel very different than anything the Japanese army has faced before. The unbroken pressure presses forward, and to understand why it felt so shocking, the story must begin earlier, long before Okinawa, when both armies learned very different lessons about how wars are fought. Long before American infantrymen stepped onto the coral beaches of the Central Pacific, the Imperial Japanese Army had already been at war for years. By 1941, Japan's ground forces were shaped not by conflict with industrial powers, but by prolonged campaigns on the Asian mainland, most notably in China. These wars forged assumptions about tempo, endurance, and the rhythm of battle that would later collide violently with American methods. Japanese infantry doctrine in the interwar period emphasized decisive engagement. Officers were trained to believe that morale, willpower, and offensive spirit determined outcomes more than material weight. This belief was not abstract. It had been reinforced repeatedly during the fighting in China after 1937, where Japanese units often faced fragmented resistance, limited artillery, and enemies unable to sustain prolonged pressure. Engagements frequently followed a pattern: contact, advance, resistance, then withdrawal or collapse by the opposing force. Battles ended not because every enemy position was destroyed, but because cohesion broke. From these experiences emerged a deeply ingrained expectation. Combat moved in pulses. Fighting surged, then receded. Nightfall brought relief. Units regrouped. Ammunition was redistributed. The wounded were evacuated. Officers planned the next day's movements under the assumption that the enemy, too, needed time to recover. This rhythm shaped everything from logistics to psychology. Japanese infantry formations carried limited supplies, in part because doctrine assumed forward momentum and short engagements. Food, water, and ammunition were expected to be captured, not continuously delivered. Artillery support was sparse and often decentralized. Heavy firepower existed, but it was not designed for sustained, day-after-day saturation. The infantryman was the decisive instrument, and his spirit was expected to compensate for shortages. When Japan entered the wider Pacific War in December 1941, these assumptions initially appeared validated. In Malaya, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies, Japanese forces advanced with speed and confidence. Allied units, often unprepared and poorly coordinated, collapsed under pressure. American and British defenders withdrew, surrendered, or were cut off. Campaigns moved quickly. The operational tempo seemed to favor the attacker, who struck first and struck hard. Yet beneath these victories lay a dangerous misreading. Japanese planners interpreted Allied withdrawals as evidence that prolonged pressure was unnecessary. The enemy, they believed, would crack before endurance became an issue. Even when fighting hardened, as it did on Bataan and Corregidor, the expectation remained that battles would reach a climax and end, not grind endlessly forward. This belief carried into the Pacific Islands, where geography and climate imposed brutal constraints on all armies involved. Dense jungle, volcanic soil, coral ridges, and narrow beaches restricted movement and visibility. In such environments, Japanese infantry tactics emphasized concealment, night attacks, and carefully prepared defensive positions designed to inflict shock and delay. Crucially, these defenses were built with the assumption that after intense contact, there would be lulls, windows of time to repair, reposition, and survive. What Japanese commanders did not yet fully understand was that they were preparing to fight an enemy shaped by a radically different military culture. The United States entered the war with a ground force that, while inexperienced in jungle combat, was rooted in industrial warfare. American military planning in the 1930s assumed long wars fought across vast distances, sustained not by individual heroism, but by logistics, rotation, and overwhelming material support. U.S. Army and Marine Corps doctrine emphasized continuity of operations, the ability to keep fighting while replacing men, weapons, and supplies without stopping the advance. This difference was not philosophical alone, it was structural. American units were backed by a logistical system that treated ammunition, food, medical care, and replacements as flowing streams rather than limited stocks. Ships, trucks, and aircraft moved constantly. Supply chains were designed to function under fire. Where Japanese units carried what they could on their backs, American units expected resupply, even in hostile terrain. The contrast became clearer as the war moved into 1942. On Guadalcanal, Japanese infantry first encountered an opponent who did not disengage after contact. U.S. Marines dug in and held ground, absorbing attacks without collapsing. More unsettling still, when night fell, American forces did not universally withdraw or pause. They patrolled. They reinforced. They prepared to attack again at first light. For Japanese soldiers accustomed to night being a time of maneuver and regrouping, this behavior was deeply unsettling. Reports from early Pacific battles describe confusion when American artillery resumed at dawn without warning, or when infantry assaults followed days of continuous bombardment rather than a single decisive push. These were not isolated incidents. As the war progressed through New Guinea, the Gilberts, and the Marshalls, a pattern emerged. American forces advanced slowly but relentlessly. When resistance was encountered, it was not bypassed and left to wither. It was reduced systematically. Positions were isolated, shelled, assaulted, and held. Then the process continued. Japanese officers began to notice something alarming. Even when American units suffered casualties, they did not withdraw to recover. New units appeared. Weapons were replaced. Firepower intensified. The enemy did not seem to grow weaker with time. In many cases, it appeared to grow stronger. This perception struck at the core of Japanese operational thinking. If battles did not pause, then traditional recovery cycles became impossible. Wounded men could not be evacuated. Ammunition could not be redistributed safely. Units became trapped in a state of permanent engagement, slowly eroded not by a single overwhelming blow, but by unbroken pressure. By 1944, as fighting reached Saipan and Peleliu, the implications were impossible to ignore. Japanese defenders found themselves under artillery fire for days or weeks without respite. Infantry assaults followed bombardments, not as climactic moments, but as one phase in a continuous process. Even when American forces paused briefly, it was not to disengage, but to reorganize for the next push. For the Japanese infantrymen, this was more than a tactical challenge. It was a psychological shock. The expected rhythm of war, fight, pause, recover, had vanished. In its place was a grinding reality where survival depended not on spirit alone, but on enduring an enemy who refused to stop. And as this new form of warfare took hold across the Pacific, the gap between how the two armies understood battle widened into something far more dangerous, setting the stage for the human, tactical, and moral collisions that defined the war's most brutal encounters. By the middle years of the Pacific War, the difference between Japanese and American approaches to ground combat was no longer theoretical. It was measurable in tonnage, manpower, and time. What had begun as unsettling encounters on Guadalcanal hardened into a systematic pattern as U.S. forces refined a method of warfare built around continuous pressure. At the center of this method was logistics, not as a supporting element, but as the engine of combat itself. American planners understood that infantry could only fight without pause if everything behind the front line moved faster than exhaustion. Ships unloaded around the clock. Engineers carved airstrips out of coral and mud within days of landing. Roads appeared where jungle had stood. This was not improvisation. It was doctrine applied at scale. For the American infantrymen, this meant something unprecedented in jungle warfare: predictability. Ammunition arrived on schedule. Rations followed. Medical evacuation, though imperfect, was constant. When units suffered heavy losses, replacements appeared not in months, but in days. The fighting man was not expected to carry the war on his back indefinitely. He was part of a system designed to keep him in contact with the enemy without collapsing. This stood in stark contrast to Japanese logistics, which deteriorated rapidly as Allied naval and air power expanded. Japanese infantry units on isolated islands often received irregular resupply, if any at all. Artillery shells became precious. Machine gun barrels wore out with no replacements. Food shortages turned chronic. The assumption that battles would end quickly now became a liability. When they did not, there was no reserve to fall back on. American operational planning exploited this imbalance deliberately. Instead of seeking dramatic breakthroughs, U.S. commanders focused on sustained engagement. Positions were fixed in place through firepower. Movement was deliberate. Ground gained was held. Even limited advances mattered because they tightened the noose. Every yard forward shortened supply lines for Americans and lengthened the isolation of Japanese defenders. Nowhere was this more apparent than in the evolution of American infantry tactics. Early in the war, U.S. units had struggled with jungle combat. But by 1943, they had adapted. Infantry, artillery, engineers, and armor began operating as a single integrated force. When resistance was encountered, it triggered a sequence rather than a pause. Reconnaissance, bombardment, assault, consolidation, then repetition. Crucially, these cycles did not align with natural breaks like nightfall. American forces increasingly fought around the clock. Night was used not for disengagement, but for reinforcement, resupply, and preparation. Patrols probed enemy positions after dark. Artillery fired pre-registered targets regardless of visibility. Japanese expectations that darkness would bring relief were repeatedly disappointed. From the Japanese perspective, This behavior bordered on incomprehensible. Their doctrine placed enormous emphasis on night operations, both as a means of concealment and psychological dominance. For decades, night attacks had been a source of advantage, but American forces adapted quickly. Flares, illumination rounds, and defensive fire plans turned darkness into a contested space rather than a sanctuary. The psychological impact of this shift cannot be overstated. Japanese infantrymen, already under strain from shortages and disease, found themselves denied rest. Accounts from post-war interrogations described the constant noise, artillery, aircraft, engines, creating a sense that the enemy was always present. Sleep became fragmented, time blurred, days lost distinction from nights. American commanders understood this effect and leaned into it. Continuous pressure was not simply about killing enemy soldiers. It was about denying them the ability to function as units. Isolated pockets of resistance were left under observation and fire rather than stormed immediately. The goal was to exhaust defenders before the final assault, reducing American casualties while ensuring the enemy could not recover. Leadership philosophy reinforced this approach. U.S. officers were trained to rotate units when possible, even within active sectors. Companies were relieved. Battalions cycled through reserve positions close to the front. Commanders were expected to preserve combat effectiveness over time, not burn out their men in single, dramatic engagements. Japanese leadership, by contrast, faced structural constraints. Withdrawal was often forbidden. Positions were held until destroyed. Relief was rare or non-existent. The belief that spirit could overcome material disadvantage persisted even as evidence mounted to the contrary. Orders emphasized endurance, but without the means to sustain it. By the time fighting reached places like Saipan and Okinawa, Japanese infantry units were operating under a fatal contradiction. They were expected to fight continuously, but had been organized for short, decisive engagements. They were told to endure, but denied the logistical support endurance required. Meanwhile, their enemy appeared inexhaustible. American after-action reports from these campaigns consistently note the same phenomenon. Resistance did not collapse suddenly. Instead, it faded. Fire slackened. Counterattacks grew weaker. Units stopped coordinating. What remained were individual defenders or small groups, cut off and unable to influence the battle's outcome. This was the cumulative effect of nonstop warfare. For Japanese soldiers experiencing it firsthand, the realization came slowly and painfully. The Americans were not reckless. They were patient. They did not rush victory. They applied pressure like weight, hour after hour, day after day, until resistance could no longer sustain itself. By the final year of the war, this method had become the defining feature of American ground operations in the Pacific. It reshaped every battle it touched and forced Japanese infantrymen to confront an enemy who did not fight by familiar rhythms. And it is within this clash of expectations, between an army that assumed battles must pause and another built to ensure they never did, that the true human and tactical angles of the story emerge. For the Japanese infantrymen, war had always involved suffering. Long marches, hunger, and disease were familiar companions. But even hardship had a rhythm. There were moments when the body could recover, when the mind could reset. In the Pacific, that rhythm disappeared. American pressure denied Japanese soldiers the most basic requirement of endurance: rest. Continuous artillery fire, intermittent infantry probes, and constant aerial presence meant that sleep came in fragments measured in minutes, not hours. Men learned to doze, sitting upright, weapons in hand, listening for the next explosion. Over time, exhaustion dulled reaction and judgment. Japanese training emphasized stoicism, but stoicism could not restore a nervous system pushed beyond its limits. Units began to fracture not from cowardice, but from fatigue. Communication failed. Orders were misunderstood or never delivered. Individual bravery remained, but collective effectiveness faded. American soldiers endured exhaustion as well, but within a system designed to manage it. Units rotated when possible. Food arrived hot. Medical care, though strained, existed. This asymmetry mattered. Endurance was no longer just a test of will. It was a logistical advantage. The longer the fighting continued without pause, the more the battlefield favored the side that could endure structurally, not just spiritually. And that realization set the stage for deeper tactical consequences. Angle 2. Tactical pressure. The weight of incremental advance. American ground tactics in the Pacific rejected the idea of dramatic breakthroughs. Instead, they favored steady compression. Each advance, no matter how small, reduced Japanese options. A ridge taken limited fields of fire. A bunker destroyed opened a path. Nothing was wasted. Japanese defenders expected attacks to culminate, followed by regrouping. Instead, assaults came in sequences. When one failed, it was not abandoned. Artillery adjusted. Engineers advanced. Infantry returned. There was no sense of a final attack, only continuation. This created a tactical trap. Japanese units committed reserves, expecting a decisive moment that never arrived. When the Americans returned again and again, those reserves were gone. Positions became isolated. Fire could no longer be masked effectively. The Americans were not faster. They were heavier. Every hour of pressure added weight to the defense until collapse became inevitable. Not dramatic, but silent. Angle 3. Psychological dislocation, when time stops making sense. Perhaps the most profound effect of nonstop fighting was psychological. Japanese soldiers lost their sense of time. Days blended together under constant noise and threat. Without pauses, there were no markers to signal survival or progress. This dislocation eroded confidence. Men could not tell whether they were winning or losing, only that the pressure continued. Traditional measures of success, like repelling an attack or surviving the night, no longer applied. American soldiers, though equally stressed, understood the pattern. They knew pressure was the plan. That knowledge itself became a form of armor. And as these human and tactical stresses accumulated, they began to influence leadership decisions and expose deeper contrasts between the two armies' philosophies of command. Japanese infantry leadership in the Pacific operated under severe constraints. Orders emphasized holding ground at all costs. Withdrawal was equated with failure, not maneuver. In theory, this was meant to preserve morale. In practice, it locked commanders into positions that became untenable under continuous American pressure. Company and battalion officers quickly discovered that leadership without the option to disengage was leadership without flexibility. When communications were severed by artillery or air attack, junior officers were forced to act independently, but always within a framework that forbade retreat. Decisions narrowed to two options: endure or die. American leadership doctrine offered more elasticity. Commanders were expected to adapt, shift axes of advance, and replace exhausted units. Holding ground mattered, but so did preserving combat power. This difference became decisive in prolonged engagements. Where Japanese officers burned through their forces in place, American commanders conserved theirs over time. The nonstop nature of American operations magnified this disparity. Leadership was no longer tested by a single decision, but by the ability to manage men through days and weeks of sustained pressure. American infantry did not fight without pause by accident. Technology made it possible. Radios linked forward observers to artillery batteries miles away. Illumination rounds turned night into twilight. Bulldozers cleared paths under fire. Flame weapons neutralized positions once immune to small arms. Japanese technology, while effective in defense, lacked redundancy. When a heavy weapon was destroyed, it was often irreplaceable. Ammunition shortages forced restraint at precisely the moments when maximum firepower was needed. The result was asymmetry. American fire could surge repeatedly. Japanese fire diminished steadily. Over time, this imbalance shaped behavior. Japanese soldiers conserved ammunition, waiting for moments that never arrived. American units expended freely, confident resupply would follow. The battlefield became a place where pressure could be maintained indefinitely, at least by one side. For Japanese infantrymen, the most unsettling aspect of American warfare was not its violence, but its refusal to conclude. Battles did not reach climaxes. They dissolved. Post-war interviews and capture documents reveal repeated references to confusion and disbelief. Defenders expected pauses that never came. They prepared for night attacks, only to face continued bombardment. They waited for exhaustion to weaken the enemy, only to find fresh units advancing. This was doctrinal shock in its purest form. An army trained for one kind of war was forced to fight another, without time to adapt. And as this shock deepened, it became clear that the decisive moments of these campaigns would not come from a single charge or counterattack, but from a turning point where the illusion of eventual relief finally collapsed. By the spring of 1945, the logic of nonstop warfare reached its most extreme expression on Okinawa. Unlike earlier island battles, this was not a fight for a narrow beachhead or a single ridge. It was a sustained ground campaign involving hundreds of thousands of men, fought over weeks of rain, mud, and broken terrain. For Japanese infantry defending the island, it was the moment when every assumption about how battles ended finally collapsed. The American landing on April 1st, 1945, achieved tactical surprise not through deception, but through absence of immediate resistance. The beaches were taken with minimal opposition. This, too, unsettled Japanese defenders. They had prepared for violent, climactic landings. Instead, the enemy came ashore calmly, efficiently, and in overwhelming numbers. Supplies flowed inland almost immediately. Artillery followed. Airfields were secured within days. Japanese forces, under General Mitsuru Ushijima, had adopted a defense-in-depth strategy. Rather than contesting the beaches, infantry units were positioned along the Shuri Line, a network of caves, ridges, and fortified positions in the island's south. The plan assumed that American forces would be drawn into costly frontal assaults, suffer casualties, and eventually slow. What the plan did not fully account for was the American capacity to maintain pressure without urgency. When U.S. forces reached the Shuri Line in early April, the fighting intensified, but it did not climax. American artillery began systematic bombardment. Not a single massive barrage, but continuous fire. Positions were mapped, targeted, and retargeted. When infantry advanced and met resistance, they halted, called for fire, and resumed. The sequence repeated endlessly. For Japanese infantrymen in the caves and trenches, days became indistinguishable. The ground shook constantly. Entrances collapsed, were cleared, then collapsed again. Water seeped in. Food ran low. Sleep vanished. The expected lull between attacks never arrived. Night brought no relief. American forces fired illumination rounds and maintained patrols. Engineers worked under cover of darkness to improve supply routes. Japanese attempts at night infiltration met prepared defenses. Losses mounted without the compensating psychological effect such attacks had once provided. The turning point was not a single assault, but the realization that the pressure would not stop. Not tomorrow, not next week. Reports from Japanese units describe mounting despair as artillery fire resumed each morning without variation. The Americans did not appear exhausted. They did not pause to recover. They simply continued. By May, the Shuri Line began to crumble, not from a dramatic breakthrough, but from attrition. Units could no longer coordinate. Communications failed. Command posts were destroyed or isolated. Infantry companies became clusters of survivors fighting independently, unable to influence the broader battle. American forces advanced methodically, ridge by ridge. When resistance stiffened, they adjusted. When progress slowed, they reinforced. There was no deadline imposed by exhaustion. Time favored the attacker. For the Japanese high command on Okinawa, this was the moment when strategy met reality. The defense in depth had assumed that sustained pressure would eventually strain American resolve. Instead, it strained Japanese endurance beyond recovery. Yet even as positions fell, there was no sense of finality. The Americans did not surge forward in celebration. They consolidated. They brought up more guns. They prepared to continue. And in that calm, relentless continuation, the full meaning of nonstop warfare became impossible to ignore for the defenders, for their commanders, and for the course of the battle itself. The realization spread quietly through shattered units and buried command posts. This was not a battle that could be waited out. It would only end when one side could no longer exist as an army. As May 1945 progressed, the battle for Okinawa entered its most revealing phase, not because of sudden maneuvers, but because of what no longer happened. Japanese counterattacks grew sporadic. Artillery fire slackened, not by design, but by necessity. Units that once fought as formations now existed as isolated pockets, connected only by shared exhaustion. American forces sensed the shift. After weeks of methodical pressure, resistance no longer responded as expected. When infantry advanced, fire came late or not at all. When bombardments lifted, there were fewer counter-movements. The defenders were still there, still dangerous, but they were no longer able to reset. This was the true turning point. Japanese commanders recognized it, even if they could not reverse it. General Ushijima's reports acknowledged that the battle had become a struggle of endurance rather than maneuver. Supplies were nearly gone. Medical facilities were overwhelmed. Units lacked the strength to exploit any opportunity, even when American advances exposed temporary gaps. The idea of a decisive moment, an attack that would shock the enemy into withdrawal, had vanished. There would be no pause in which to reorganize, no night in which to restore cohesion. The Americans had denied those possibilities entirely. In late May, Japanese forces abandoned the Shuri Line. It was not a retreat in the conventional sense, but a forced withdrawal under constant pressure. As units moved south, they were harassed by artillery and airstrikes. Positions intended as temporary stops became final stands. For Japanese infantrymen, this movement confirmed what many had already understood. The battle was unwinnable, not because of a single failure, but because the enemy would not stop long enough for recovery. Even survival became provisional, measured in hours rather than days. American commanders, meanwhile, did not alter their approach. They advanced carefully, aware that desperate resistance remained possible. Continuous pressure did not mean reckless speed. It meant denying the enemy any chance to regain balance. Casualties on both sides mounted. The Americans paid heavily, particularly among frontline infantry. But replacements arrived. Units were reinforced. Firepower remained constant. The system held. By June, organized Japanese resistance collapsed into scattered groups. Some fought to the end. Others could no longer fight at all. What remained of the Japanese army on Okinawa was no longer an operational force, but a collection of individuals bound by circumstance rather than command. The psychological impact of this collapse extended beyond the island. Reports filtered back through surviving officers and post-war analysis. The lesson was unmistakable. An enemy capable of fighting without pause altered the fundamental nature of ground combat. Defensive doctrines built on endurance and spirit alone were insufficient. Okinawa was not unique in this respect. Similar patterns had appeared earlier at Peleliu in Saipan. But on Okinawa, the scale made the lesson unavoidable. Continuous American pressure did not seek dramatic victory. It sought inevitability, and inevitability proved more powerful than any single assault. As the battle drew toward its grim conclusion, the implications reached far beyond the island. Japanese infantry doctrine, once confident in its assumptions, had been broken not by surprise or speed, but by time itself, weaponized and applied without mercy. What followed would shape not only the immediate outcome of the battle, but the strategic and psychological aftermath of the Pacific War. When organized resistance on Okinawa finally collapsed in June 1945, the battlefield did not fall silent. Smoke still rose from shattered ridges. Artillery echoed intermittently as American units cleared remaining pockets of resistance. The fighting had not ended with a surrender or a decisive final engagement. It faded unevenly into exhaustion. The human cost was staggering. More than 12,000 American soldiers and Marines were killed, with over 49,000 wounded. Japanese military losses were far higher. Estimates exceed 90,000 dead, with thousands more unaccounted for. These numbers, while stark, do not fully capture the nature of the defeat. Japanese forces were not merely beaten. They were worn down to the point where coordinated resistance ceased to exist. For surviving Japanese infantrymen, the aftermath was defined by disintegration. Units no longer functioned. Command structures collapsed. Wounded men lay untreated. Ammunition was gone. Food had been consumed or destroyed. Many soldiers survived only by hiding in caves or attempting to evade advancing American patrols. American forces encountered defenders who were no longer capable of organized combat. Some resisted sporadically. Others were immobilized by injury or exhaustion. The psychological toll of continuous pressure had stripped away the cohesion that once defined Japanese infantry formations. U.S. after-action reports noted this phenomenon repeatedly. Resistance weakened not at a specific moment, but gradually. Fire discipline deteriorated. Counterattacks became rare. When they occurred, they lacked coordination and supporting fire. The Japanese army on Okinawa had not been decisively broken in a single blow. It had been ground down. This pattern shaped American strategic thinking almost immediately. Okinawa was understood not just as a tactical victory, but as proof of concept. Continuous operations, sustained firepower, and relentless pressure could defeat even deeply entrenched defenders willing to fight to the death. The price was high, but the method worked. For Japanese leadership, the implications were devastating. Reports reaching Tokyo painted a bleak picture. Infantry units had fought bravely, but bravery had not compensated for isolation, shortages, and exhaustion. The assumption that the enemy would tire, pause, or disengage proved fatally wrong. This realization extended beyond Okinawa. Survivors from earlier battles, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, had reported similar experiences. But Okinawa confirmed the pattern at a scale that could not be dismissed. The Americans did not seek quick victories. They accepted time and casualties in exchange for certainty. Among Japanese soldiers and officers, this understanding contributed to a profound sense of inevitability. If the enemy could apply pressure indefinitely, then every future defense would face the same outcome. There would be no recovery periods, no chance to regroup. Every battle would be a slow erosion. For American infantrymen, the aftermath carried its own weight. Victory did not feel triumphant. The cost was visible everywhere, in the wounded, in the graves, in the ruined landscape. Continuous fighting exacted its toll on the attackers as well. Fatigue, trauma, and loss accumulated quietly. Yet the system endured. Units were rotated. Reinforcements arrived. Medical care expanded. Even after weeks of non-stop combat, American forces remained operational. This capacity, more than any single weapon, defined the outcome. As Okinawa stabilized under American control, planners looked ahead. The same method would be required again, perhaps on an even greater scale. The lessons of nonstop warfare were no longer theoretical. They were written into casualty lists and after-action reports. And as the Pacific War moved toward its final, uncertain phase, both sides understood that the future would not bring relief, but only the continuation of pressure applied until one side could no longer continue. In the weeks following the battle, Okinawa became a vast processing ground for wounded men, displaced civilians, and lessons that would shape the final decisions of the war. The island's capture was not merely territorial. It was psychological. It demonstrated with brutal clarity what prolonged, unrelenting ground combat now meant. For the Japanese army, Okinawa forced a reckoning. Surviving officers submitted reports that quietly acknowledged the failure of existing doctrine. Infantry units had not collapsed from lack of courage, but from cumulative exhaustion and isolation. Defensive positions designed to hold indefinitely could not function when resupply ceased and pressure never lifted. The belief that time favored the defender had been overturned. These assessments filtered upward into strategic discussions about the defense of the Japanese home islands. Plans still called for resistance, but expectations shifted. Leaders understood that any future invasion would resemble Okinawa on a vastly larger scale. Continuous American pressure would deny defenders the ability to recover. Casualties would mount without respite. For American commanders, Okinawa validated their approach, but it also raised grave concerns. Continuous operations worked, but they were costly. Infantry divisions had been pushed to their limits. Psychological strain was evident. The question was no longer whether nonstop warfare could defeat Japan, but how many lives it would require. This tension influenced high-level planning in the final months of the war. The projected invasion of Kyushu assumed sustained ground fighting under similar conditions. Estimates of casualties reflected the expectation that Japanese resistance, while doomed, would not collapse quickly. Okinawa had shown how long such battles could last. On the ground, American units continued clearing operations, encountering remnants of Japanese forces weeks after organized resistance ended. These encounters underscored the lingering effects of continuous pressure. Some defenders fought reflexively, without coordination or objective. Others surrendered, physically unable to continue. Japanese infantrymen who survived often described the same experience, the sense that the battle never truly paused. Even after defeat, there was no clear transition from combat to safety. The pressure had not merely defeated them. It had reshaped their perception of war itself. Among American veterans, Okinawa left a different imprint. The methodical nature of the fighting, the absence of dramatic victories, and the constant exposure to danger created a unique psychological burden. Many later recalled the exhaustion of endless advance, where success was measured in yards and days, not moments. Strategically, Okinawa marked the final confirmation that industrial warfare had reached its logical extreme. Victory no longer depended on decisive clashes alone, but on the ability to sustain force indefinitely. Armies that could not match this endurance would be destroyed, regardless of individual bravery. For the Japanese army, this realization came too late to alter the war's outcome. For the United States, it reinforced a sobering truth. Winning through nonstop pressure was effective, but it demanded a cost measured not just in numbers, but in human endurance. As Okinawa faded from the headlines and the war moved toward its conclusion, the lessons of the island remained unresolved. They hung over every planning table, every intelligence estimate, and every soldier preparing for what might come next. And in that quiet, uneasy aftermath, the meaning of relentless warfare began to settle into history, not as a triumph of speed or surprise, but as a testament to what happens when one side can simply refuse to stop. Okinawa, Saipan, Peleliu. These battles revealed a truth that would redefine modern warfare. Relentless pressure could become a weapon as decisive as any gun or artillery shell. The Americans did not fight for dramatic moments, nor for the thrill of a single breakthrough. They fought to deny the enemy pause, to strip away every chance for recovery, until the opposing force ceased to function as an army. For the Japanese infantrymen, this was a harsh lesson. Decades of doctrine, honed in China and early Pacific victories, assumed rhythm in battle. Pause, regroup, counterattack. Those expectations were shattered. Survival depended not on courage alone, but on enduring a relentless tempo that neither humans nor logistics could sustain indefinitely. The clash was not just of armies, but of concepts: endurance versus system, human spirit versus industrial capability. The Americans, conversely, demonstrated how doctrine, logistics, and technology could sustain continuous operations. Firepower was not a blunt instrument. It was applied with calculation, reinforcing the human and tactical advantage. Troops rotated, supplies flowed, and the pressure never lifted, not as recklessness, but as strategy. In this way, the pace of war became a weapon itself. Okinawa stands as a cautionary tale and a historical pivot. It illustrates how modern combat is measured not merely in courage or skill, but in the capacity to maintain force, to endure, and to apply pressure with unbroken consistency. It also highlights the human cost, exhaustion, fear, and the psychological toll that accumulates when time itself becomes the instrument of warfare. History remembers the island not only for the lives lost, but for what it taught about the nature of conflict. When one side fights without pause, every tradition, expectation, and doctrine of the other is tested to its limit. And in that test, the very meaning of battle, what it is, and how it can be won, changes forever. The story of nonstop warfare in the Pacific is not merely about victory or defeat. It is a testament to endurance, to systemized pressure, and to the profound ways in which war can redefine what it means to fight. In the echoes of coral ridges and cave-filled hills, one lesson endures. Sometimes, the most devastating weapon is time itself, applied without mercy.